Today we will be discussing the poem Fading, written by Daniel Sanguinetti. Today's presentation was created by Daniel, Kerrick, Ariana, Dante, and Katiya. Fading is modeled after country western singer by Alan Shapiro, found on page 204 of Best of the Best American Poetry. The model poem itself is notable for its narrative, song-like structure and devices, and chilling ending. Shapiro tells the story of a singer who succumbed to the vicious cycle of alcoholism. The poem ends with the speaker in the hospital, reframing the entire narrative as a recounting of their life from the hospital bed. Fading borrows in both the devices used and in some of the imagery and motifs presented by Shapiro, but with its own story. Like the model poem, Fading features intricate rhyme schemes, an emotional narrative, and reflections on mortality and the past. Despite these similarities, Fading is different enough in its own ways from the model. The emphasis on rhyme is much greater, along with the more pronounced use of repetition and a greater variety in meter and rhythm. Fading also deviates heavily in its structure with its use of refrain and its final stanza contrasting heavily with the rest of the poem, as opposed to Country Western Singer, where each stanza from beginning to end follows the exact same structure and rhyme scheme.
We now move on to the rationale for selecting this poem. When it came time to selecting this poem, we acknowledged that this poem had two foundational elements that set the analysis in motion. The first is the passage of time. This is one of those elements that is theoretical. We so often think of it as something unseen, yet we can sense it. We can feel when we age because of the passage of time. Yet, it's a theoretical extension of the immaterial. When we look at the poem in question, we think about the units of measurement being used. We don't think about this in terms of seconds, minutes, hours, though we find an instance where the word day is used. We're looking at words like summers as a way of communicating what it is to transition from one point of suffering to another. And in order to make an exchange, it's being used as a wager. The other element we need to look at is the senses, since they are extensively explored. Time is seen as theoretical, but the senses are now more practical. When we see this poem, we can think about how the senses are a way for humans to respond to the environment. However, from a philosophical standpoint, these senses leave an impression on the mind, as Aristotle would argue. So when we think about the senses interacting with the immaterial, we can begin to see how time works in this model. With both elements in mind, we have to ask ourselves, how do the senses act as a conduit for outward expression of inner turmoil under these circumstances? In other words, when the senses are blurred, how do we find the inward self, the immaterial emotional side, being expressed through the senses? If we frequently think about the senses bringing information to the brain, how can we invert reality to demonstrate the immaterial reaching out to the material world? This was our approach to the text. Having covered the selection process, we want to turn your attention to the three outcomes we gained from this selection process. The first principle is the way in which we express sorrow and hidden truth. In all the poems analyzed, we saw glimpses of what it means to wrestle with tragedy in the human experience, and how the outward expression represents to the general public a failure on the part of the individual for reporting their concealed reality. Creating the space for that tension is critical in poetry, and we find that we can flourish through this practice. The second is that simplicity can establish that desired tension. By honing in on one particular sense, or stating what is happening in a narrative, we can wrestle with the environment, ourselves, or a particular aspect of life. This helps to create a unique and complex narrative. Finally, we come to understand that language can be reinvented. We don't simply mean to say that the meaning of words can change. Rather, what they represent can be malleable. Can we think of a unit of measurement, like a collection of summers, as an artificially constructed way of measuring time through the lens of suffering? These are the types of questions that we can think about in this last point.
Daniel Sanguinetti's fading features numerous rhetorical elements, several of which include didacticism and prosody. However, the two most prominent elements are those of parallelism and verse. In regards to parallelism, it, as defined by Huey and Kaneko on page 34 in Poetry: A Writer's Guide and Anthology, is a figure of speech in which consecutive sentences or phrases have identical grammatical constructions. Daniel's poem features multiple lines which are composed of the same construction, typically within the same line with separate segments paralleling each other. One thing to note is that fading is composed of short verses, so most of the lines feature very simple verse formations. Examples include the verse, "It kills me, it drains me," where the second portion of the verse, "It drains me," is a grammatically parallel construction of the preceding portion of the verse, "It kills me." Two other verses in which a similar parallelism occurs are "I can't walk, I can't see," and "I can't lose, I can't leave." One final primary example is in the stanza, "Each day the rain passes through my hands, each day I cast a lighter shade of gray, each day I face the taunts of falling sand." This stanza features a set of parallelism where the three verses are constructed the same grammatically. Each day the rain, each day I cast, and each day I face are nearly identical in their overall formation. The parallelism in this poem enables a rhythmic flow to be established, especially when performing the poem aloud, and creates emphasis on the actions occurring within the sentence or the subject of the sentence. "It kills me, it drains me," in particular, emphasizes the nature of the speaker's illness in that it is not simply killing the speaker, but sucking the literal life out of them. As for the second primary rhetorical element, verse and its manipulation are prevalent throughout fading. Huey and Kaneko's definition of verse on page 35 states that it is a poetic composition, any grouping of words into a poetic form. As Daniel's poem is a lineated poem, there is more consistency when observing verse. The specific line breaks often occur near the end of ideas or are in jammed lines, and verses persistently begin with capital letters to indicate that the lines are separate ideas, and occasionally conclude with rhetorical questions which entail that the preceding content before the question was all one complete concept. One particular stanza which features verses that include enjambment, selective capitalization, and a rhetorical question to conclude the stanza is, "Each day the rain passes through my hands, each day I cast a lighter shade of gray, each day I face the taunts of falling sand, will my memory last when I fade away." The final two verses are rather intriguing as the first line ends with enjambment, "Will my memory last?" which causes the reader to wonder what the question will specifically ask, while the second verse, "When I fade away," both completes the question, not separating the verses with capitalization, and offers a final rhetorical question that the reader will be left to ponder as they read the concluding stanza of fading. The construction of these verses creates a philosophical tone that enhances the quality of the poem, as the pauses in enjambment cause the reader to truly regard what is being addressed in fading.
Fading by Daniel Sanguinetti uses many poetic elements. Daniel effectively uses music, repetition, mood, voice, showing and telling, lyrics, gravity and lightness, defamiliarization, and narrative, to name a few. However, the two poetic elements I feel he uses most clearly, and the ones that make his poem great, are image and ending. Right off the bat, the reader is hit with the line, "bright sterile halls." Not only does the imagery from this line establish a setting for the reader, but it also establishes a mood. It simply but effectively puts the reader in the eyes of the narrator, showing the reader a bright and possibly fluorescently lit, sterile, and maybe white hallway reminiscent of a hospital. This sets the overall mood that is sustained throughout the whole poem, an overall sense of death or doom. The very next line also snaps a clear image. The skyline grays in this graveyard. Not much needs to be said about this line, as Daniel clearly sets an image in the reader's mind. Throughout the rest of this poem, imagery is used much to the same effect, not only helping the reader through this journey, but also the narrator as they make visual and tangible sense of very abstract ideas. Some other examples of imagery in this poem are as follows. Each day the rain passes through my hands. A lighter shade of gray, each day I face the taunts of falling sand. Furthermore, the whole poem plays with heavy themes and philosophical ideas. An interpretation of this poem can be seen as the narrator thinking through and experiencing the passage of time, eventually leading to the narrator's death, or death in general. The poem moves through all these thoughts, sometimes looping back on itself, but eventually ends with the line, "You'll realize to live is to die." The line punctuates the poem in such a way that may leave the reader stunned, but also in a state of reflection. Not only this, but the line also acts as an answer to the questions the lines previously posed. The line, and consequentially the whole poem, poses a nihilistic answer to life and existentialism.
Areas of improvement. Some major influences for this piece was utilizing lyric and music. It is intended for this poem to flow smoothly like a song. However, in some parts of Fading, the flow became choppy, such as in "Each day the rain passes through my hands. Each day I cast a lighter shade of gray." This can be improved by rearranging the line and adding punctuation, such as "Each day the rain passes through my hands," followed by a new line, "Each day I cast a lighter shade of gray." This will improve the vocalization when reading out loud and on paper. Additionally, less can sometimes be more. While Fading uses repetition as a strength, sometimes the repetition was too wordy and assisting phrases to develop the theme lost its emphasis. As well, there were lines that frequently became phrases, and once again ruined the lyrical flow of this poem. Lastly, a final thing that could have been improved on was a further exploration of the role of the pills and how they would aid in the development of the perspective, either as a secondary character or a tool for distraction. We know what they are and what they do, but it is possible to know if their role ever changes.